Hello, and welcome to Game Developers Library, a podcast about books which game developers should probably read, or at least be knowledgeable about some of the stuff in those books.
The Game Developers Library.
I am Joe Baxter-Webb from Indie Game Clinic. I am a game designer of, 10 years professionally and 30 years unprofessionally, and academic who spent some time researching games and teaching university students how to do game design and game development and stuff like that. And this podcast is my way of forcing myself to read books and keep up to date, which is why this month I've been reading a book from 2012 about video games, which was suggested for this episode by my co-host, Tom. Hello, Tom.
Hi, Joe. I'm Tom. I'm going to finally introduce myself on this podcast after 4 episodes or however it's been. Yeah, I'm a professional game programmer. I've been working in the industry for 7 years now, and again, much like yourself, for many years before that, working on weird creative side projects. And I've been a creative developer my entire professional career, which is very long now.
Yeah, so we both kind of work on our own projects and sort of discuss them off air and all of that kind of stuff. And then have had various different roles in the industry. And Tom is more of a kind of creative techie person, and I have ended up in various production and design roles, and that's sort of very much into like tabletop design and stuff like that as well, which I think is a interesting starting point for this book, because it's really kind of aimed at people that perhaps haven't made games yet and maybe a little bit anxious about the technical side of things, but it's a book that does a few different things at once. So Tom, you said you'd had this sort of on your shelf for a while before we picked it for the podcast.
Yeah, it's very similar to a book that was like very formative to me that I read in high school called Make Your Own Damn Movie by Lloyd Kaufman, who was the founder of Troma Video. And it was, again, a very sort of a trying to be inspirational book about getting ordinary people to ignore the sort of traditional barriers that you might perceive, making your own movie in that case. And, in high school, I thought I wanted to be a filmmaker, but instead of doing that, I was working on weird Flash things, and that sort of led me to this point instead. So, yeah, that sort of feels like the film version of this book.
Yeah. So the Troma is the studio that made like the Toxic Avenger and stuff like that.
Yeah, and Sergeant Kabuki Man.
A sort of super gross out, like MTV liquid television era, kind of gross out, edgy, but kind of edgy but silly humor.
Yeah, it's sort of venerating like cult filmmaking or trash film.
Yeah, so because I haven't mentioned it yet, the book we're actually looking at, it has an incredibly long subtitle, which I think we're probably going to come back to multiple times. So, Anthropy, Rise of the Videogame Zinesters, How Freaks, Normals, Amateurs, Artists, Dreamers, Dropouts, Queers, Housewives, and People Like You are taking back an art form. So there's quite a broad range of people in the title. And it's kind of, I would say, a sort of, divisive if you want to look at it that way, or it's kind of putting a flag in the sand because it's saying you're taking back an art form. So the implication is that not everyone has the art form, and that this is going to be a book that's about that. So it is sort of like a book that has a very overtly sort of political slant to it, at least in the way it's framed. And I think that comes across in the language. So when we looked at Tin and Sylvester's book, we were both a little bit kind of snarky about the fact that it talks about the reader as an assumed man. And this does the opposite. The player or the developer is she all the way through. I think the difference really is that this has a very clear stance and reason it's doing that, whereas with Tin and Sylvester we were told it was because singular that they is grammatically unworkable.
Yeah, well, and Anthropy didn't have that in the prefix where there's no no better word, so I'm okay with it.
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing with that book. It was almost like I would have just preferred if you'd been a little bit sexist than if you'd been a little bit sexist and then blamed it on language, you know?
To be honest, I probably would have noticed if he hadn't brought it up.
Yeah, yeah, it was like too much lampshading. Because I had people comment on that episode and say, well, what's the designer supposed to do? Are they supposed to say the player every time? Are they supposed to say they and the player? And I thought, well, you know, I think the chances are that I've probably written more game design documentation than the person leaving this comment. And I have managed to write the player and they every time for 10 years. And some of that in studios where our assumed player, you know, was a man and where everyone I was working with were men. It's just sort of like a general decency thing. But in this book, it's like much more, it's got a very clear reason it's doing that. And people are still going to find issue with that as they will with anything. But it's a little bit more like, okay, it's political, but there's a clear reason for the politics rather than, you know, what tends to happen with more conservative takes on these things, which is for it to be political and then to pretend it's not and to pretend it's just like the natural way of the world, you know?
Yeah, which is its own kind of politics.
Yeah. But I think, you know, I don't want to spend too long on that, but it is going to take us to the big thing that is going to decide whether or not people are going to get on well with this book, which is that I think you can tell from the title and the fact that it's a big, like, garish pink and yellow book, which is both signaling that it's kind of for perhaps a queer or femme audience through the aesthetics of it, and also kind of it's lo-fi, isn't it? It's got like all of this little pixel art on the cover that is very kind of grungy looking,
yeah,
MS Paint type
no,
stuff.
it's a very, very DIY, and yeah, like I think the book starts very angry, and it gets less angry as it goes on. But I think that is, yeah, like a way to sort of filter readers.
Yeah. So if people don't get on with that, they'll probably won't get on with the book. But it does, yeah, like you say, it sort of tones down as the book goes on. There's a few threads running through it, and for some people, they'll really tie together very well. You know, it's kind of like a potted history of hobbyist development from like, I don't know, 2000 to 2012, right? Which is, I guess, the same sort of time that you and I were getting into this stuff. And I feel like we talk about Newgrounds on every episode.
Yeah.
But it's hard not to. And, you know, there'll be equivalents now of like things like Roblox being like, you know, a common way that people get into making their first games and things like that, which predates this book a little bit. But you've got like a kind of social history of hobbyist game development. There's also an argument throughout of like a game developer being like an author, which we can talk about in a little bit more detail, which I think is interesting in terms of, you know, how it works to speak to a different audience of potential game developers. Where did you learn about the author from? Where did you learn about Anthropy from first time round?
I think it was mostly from reading articles with larger developers. So, you know, it's sort of a name that would occasionally get dropped. You know, like talking to people like Bennett Foddy or Ed McMillan. So, yeah, there was very clearly like an earlier scene of developers that were sharing ideas. And yeah, and Anthropy was there. Like, I think she mentions it in the book. There was a documentary that I don't know if it ever got released, but I remember seeing trailers for it called like, you meet the nicest people making video games. I was like, you know, after Indie Game, the movie came out, and I was like trying to just consume everything I could about, you know, learning about who these people are and where these games are coming from. Yeah, that was definitely like a name that would get dropped.
Yeah. So I sort of encountered Anthropy through her games first. And the one that kind of came out at the same time of this book was Dysphoria, which, you know, I think if you're like a trans creator and you've made a famous game about what it's like to have gender dysphoria, you don't necessarily want that to be remembered as your main thing for your whole life, but it was very impactful at the time. And, you know, part of that is because it's kind of quote unquote an empathy game. So you can sort of show it to someone who's cis and they can experience a certain thing through it and then go, oh, now I understand that trans people are people. Aren't I good? I can have a cookie kind of thing. But there's also stuff like, I think the thing that made that really stand out to me, I don't know if you've ever played it, but it's like so garish and arcadey. And it's like, just like really leery, kind of femme colors, you know, like if you take the colors they use on those kind of girly Lego sets,
Yeah.
you know, like Lego elves, and then just make that as saturated as possible and make 1-bit art with it. So, Dysphoria is a really cool game as a historical artifact of like, here is someone's attempt to show their experience in a way that's very personal, but also is so kind of abstract and cartoony because it's this kind of ZX Spectrum level crunchy art, and it's so bright. And I think it's just a really cool art object because of that. And then around about the same time, Anthropy was making games like Lesbian Spider Queens of Mars.
That one I was familiar with because I was like playing a lot of the Adult Swim games that were getting released at the time.
Yeah, so that's mentioned in the book, and I think that one of the threads through the book as well, because I think listeners to this podcast need to be aware that this is not a book about how to make money making games. It is a book about games as an expressive kind of form of creativity that people might enjoy doing, or people might get something out of, or people might kind of contribute to culture with. It is not a book that is like, here is how I made money making games and you can too. Although there are moments in it where there's a little bit of talk of how that worked at the time. So, for example, Lesbian Spider Queens of Mars, which is a sort of like classic Pac-Man-y type arcade game with a lesbian BDSM theme, got picked up by Adult Swim and like hosted on their webpage, and that was one of the ways that you could make money as a small game developer at that time, right?
Yeah, and again, that was like something I don't know is all that possible to do anymore. But yeah, at the time, if you were making enough games, you could release them places and make enough to pay your rent and eat long enough to make the next one.
Yeah, it's not like there's no stuff in here that's like an instruction guide on how to do that, but it did make me think about how we tend to be very focused myopically on like whatever the current main way of monetizing games is, and there's often these like fringe ways of doing it, and that might still exist on some platforms. I can't remember the name of the studio that is like they have a Patreon and they put out like a small game every month.
The Sock Pop Collective.
Yep. Yes, that kind of stuff. I think when people kind of get beyond like the platform mentality of like, I'm making a game for Steam, I must do exactly this thing, and instead kind of start to think of like, well, can I create my own opportunities by doing other stuff? I think there's like a benefit to hearing about those historical examples of how, making a living, making small games has changed over the years and hasn't always just been, I need to put something on Steam and then cross my fingers and spam Reddit every day.
Yeah, well, I mean, going back to the Make Your Own Damn Movie book, like it's got the preface has always stuck with me because it was written by, I think it was Trey Parker or maybe Matt Stone, one of the South Park guys, because they released sort of their first movie before they did South Park through Troma. And they had this story about, meeting Lloyd Kaufman in a Taco Bell and him saying, we can release it on VHS and, you might make $3,000 and, they were sort of like upset and ready to leave. And he said, well, why did you make this? Like, did you make it so people would watch it, or did you make it to become millionaires? Because, I can distribute this and the most number of people will see this. And that was like a creative sort of realignment for them. That's always stuck with me. But, like, not saying it's like a formula for success, but success can often follow pursuing, creative endeavors like that.
Yeah. Just to sort of explain the title as well for people that aren't familiar with zines or what a zinester is, because I think that's key, because that's helping. That's what the whole ethos of the book is, right? Like a zine is like a small personal magazine that you make about whatever you're interested in. It could be yourself. It could be like a place to put your artwork or your comics. It could be it could be an instruction manual, And the point is, you're making some sort of small scale indie media where you're doing as much of it as you can yourself, and you might be giving them out free. You might be swapping them with other zinesters. You might be charging people a few dollars for them, and that's kind of the mentality that this book has. It's interesting that it's used as a sort of metaphor for here, where it's like, oh yeah, people will know what a zinester is, so I can explain video games that way. It's like, I feel like, I feel like fewer people know what a zine is than an indie game nowadays. But I think it's referring to a subculture of indie game development, not all of indie game development, that still exists now. And I think the type of approach that Anthropy is talking about in this book is what I would associate with people that are making games on itch at the moment. It's like they're making them, and this is who I feel aligned with myself. It's like they're making them because they have an idea and they want to make something cool. And if they sort of accidentally make something good and have a product at the end of that, that's great. That's a bonus. But they would be doing this as a craft anyway. And I feel like quite a strong affinity with that.
Yeah, no, me too. Like, if you've got the itch, you know, if you can sort of like feel that impulse inside you, like, I've seen interviews with again, Ed McMillan, where he's sort of like talking about, well, you know, if I hadn't been a success with, you know, Super Meat Boy and Binding of Isaac, I'd be working at a GameStop, but I'd still be like doing this in my spare time because it's my art.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that's a noble pursuit.
Yeah, I find it very difficult to relate to people that don't have that relationship to it, where people are like, should I start making games? I don't know if it's worth it. And it's like, well, I don't know. I feel like if you want to do it, you do. I mean, obviously people have barriers, but you express what you want to do in the world, but through what you do. And if you would rather sit and watch TV for 4 hours than learn how to do something difficult, then you're a TV watcher and not a game developer, you know? And you can do both. But you might have to not sleep or something.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend that one. I've tried it for a while.
So yeah, I mean, that's the kind of context that this book comes out of. And like you say, Bennett Foddy's name dropped in there, Ed McMillan's name dropped in there. So it's not like, I mean, maybe it might seem that way in retrospect, but it's not like there's this kind of commercial indie game scene that we know of now that was in opposition to this. It was like a mixing pot with folks like Anthropy who were having some commercial success as game developers, but were also a little bit more focused on sort of games as art and expressing themselves, and maybe went on more to be like teachers and writers and stuff, as well as making games, rather than doing what like Ed McMillan did and just kind of becoming fully immersed in being like a commercial game developer.
Yeah, it's sort of the alternative path, and like I kind of think Indie Game the movie kind of did a bit of damage when it came out, because it sort of like created the idea that, you know, you can live off dust for 5 years creating a masterpiece, and then at the end of it you're sort of a millionaire and you can pursue your own creative ideas without having to worry about, you know, income for the rest of your life, versus the sort of method that Anthropy and, you know, people like the Sock Pop Collective have pursued, where it's like, well, we're going to make lots of little things, and that'll sort of like we'll learn a lot along the way and like improve our craft, and, you know, some of it might find an audience, and hopefully, you know, you make enough that you can sort of keep doing that without having to, you know, find another job to make ends meet in the meantime.
Yeah. I would love there to be some sort of middle path between those things, because obviously it's not good advice for most people to spend 5 years on a game.
Yeah.
But then at the other end of the spectrum, like a lot of the people that I interact with on YouTube and Reddit, it feels like the folks that are trying to do the quick turnaround games are doing it more because they want to ship something as quickly as possible, and they don't really care about the quality of that thing. And I would love it if people were like finding some happy middle ground between that, of like, okay, I'm going to make something that I actually think is cool and I care about, but I'm going to like do that in a way that's sustainable by making like the micro version of the game I want to make, you know?
Yeah, no, and, you know, we've sort of spoken about studios in the past that have sort of, like, you can see their evolution building on like previous ideas. Like Supergiant's the one that I always think of. Bastion was like still a pretty big game when it came out, but it wasn't Hades, but you can sort of see all the steps that they've like, you know, been building on top of.
I mean, we've got a brilliant case study of that recently with Marathon, right? Where people have been going back and playing Bungie's original sort of 1994 Marathon and seeing like what ideas have survived, which is there's fun. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's the kind of the context of this book. I think in terms of what people can expect from it, I think this is a good book to either read or gift someone if they seem to be someone that is very curious about games and is more oriented towards like story games or games which express ideas, and they're maybe a little bit anxious about the technical side, because what it does is it kind of makes this argument about games and what they could be used for and stuff in the first half of the book, and then the last couple of chapters are, like you said about the film version of the book. It starts to get you into like the mindset of like, right, you're going to make something now.
Yeah.
So it doesn't like give you a technical tutorial for a specific engine, but it kind of, we can go into more detail later on, but it sort of takes you through making a game as a process of telling a story with meaning. So it's like, okay, you're going to draw a little character on the screen. What are they? Okay, there's something they're trying to do and something they're trying to avoid happening, like a win state and a lose state. But it's all described to you in terms of the meaning of what's happening, as if it's a little kind of cartoon story, rather than trying to get you super deep immediately into like designing games qua games.
Yeah, she doesn't start with like, what is an if statement?
Yeah, she doesn't start with the technical thing of what is an if statement, and she also doesn't start with like the game design stuff. Like the phrase mechanics, I don't think is used much in this book. She talks about rules, and a lot of the time, I think game designer is used, but a lot of the time she's talking about the author of a game, and like games being like individualist or small scale, people writing a story that you can interact with. And that doesn't necessarily mean like a bunch of dialogue, but it's interesting because I've taught introductory games programming this way before. We'd make like a Tamagotchi, we'd make a little character, and it'd be like, okay, you chose for your character to be, and I think when I set this task, I would say it's not allowed to be an animal, right? So they go, okay, my Tamagotchi is a nuclear power plant, or my Tamagotchi is a castle, or my Tamagotchi is a robot, or whatever. And they go, okay, what are its three needs? And they need to be something that there's a clear verb to meet the need. Like when the pet is dirty, you clean it. And then there needs to be a clear icon for what that verb is. And you're drawing everything out of the theme. So, like you're saying, what does the player do? Well, they click these buttons, but what do those buttons represent? They represent feeding when the character is hungry and stuff like that. And that's how I would teach very intro games programming to a group of students where some of them didn't have any programming knowledge and some of them were coming much more from like an art and literature background, and you just had a mixed group. And the way that this book kind of finishes when you get into the last 2 or 3 chapters that are kind of instructing you on how to actually start thinking about making games takes the same format, and that was kind of validating to see that at the end of the book.
Yeah, like, I mean, verbs are still something that I often like reify when working on, projects. Like I'm working on this Cave of Cud style roguelike, one of my many side projects. But yeah, the way I've sort of like componentized it is like verbs are a type of object in the game that can be attached to different entities to make them do things. So, verb's something that like is not a technical thing to think about. Like you're familiar with language, but it's also useful on the technical side as well.
Yeah. The argument that the book is making throughout is that, games offer unique ways of expressing yourself. Yeah. And that's why if you're even slightly interested in making games, you should have a go at it. And it does a lot of this kind of positioning of like, hey, you're not a programmer, you're an author. You're not a game designer, you're an author. And we're going to explain everything through sort of terminology that you might already know from like an English class or something like that. There's a lot of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I wonder how useful it is. Like, I think the important thing is like, giving people permission to give it a go. But yeah, once you sort of like pass that barrier, I don't know if it's important that you sort of like see yourself as an author or a developer or maybe there's a designer. There's got to be a better name for it.
Yeah, I think it's giving people entry points, isn't it? Because if you like, one of the problems I had with Twine was when Twine was popular. So if people aren't familiar with it, Twine is like a interactive fiction authoring software. And when that got really popular, there was lots of talk about how it's going to democratize game making and make it easier for people. And I think what it really did was just shift the emphasis of what skills you needed, because to make a good Twine, you kind of need to be good at writing in prose. Otherwise, what you make is not very interesting or appealing to anyone.
Yeah, no. She spends a lot of the book sort of talking about like her idealized imaginary tool for game making where you can like literally draw into the screen and sort of like, summon it to life. But yeah, I think there's always going to be like any other craft, there's going to be like some sort of like skill level, and like you want to make the barrier to entry as low as possible. So you can make something a little bit crap, but it works and makes you want to do like the next thing. But yeah, I don't think there's ever going to be a zero skill entry point.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of, you need multiple entry points that meet different types of people where they are, right? Because you can have the entry point where it's like you start with the programming and you use like a kid's programming thing like Scratch, and that's one entry point. And then you can have another entry point where it's like, okay, you're totally phobic of programming. We're going to start with natural English language, which is what Inform does, which Anthropy talks about in the book as well, which is like a interactive fiction engine where you actually program it in English. And I think there's a temptation to like take one of those things, like the thing that Anthropy described, where you can just draw the game and then make it work, which I think the piece of software which comes closest to that, which she mentions in the book, is WarioWare DIY. And she's sort of like, okay, there's lots of tools that I'm going to mention in this book, and we get there's a really good rundown throughout the book of all of these tools that are still active that you can use to do various kind of intro game dev stuff. And WarioWare is the only one that's mentioned that's like a commercial piece of software, because it's the closest to how Anthropy imagines like a really good intro game design tool is, because you just draw the objects and then you assign them little simple behaviors that already exist, and then you've got a game.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's this kind of idea that, oh, if we make it image based, then it's going to be easier for everyone, or if we make it language based, is going to be easier for everyone, and what you really need is like a diversity of tools, and that's what the book kind of gives you a rundown of. And some of them will be out of date, but a lot of them, like ZZT and stuff, they just still exist.
Yeah, and like, I mean, going back to Flash, which is like how I got into game development, and it's like I was a Flash developer for the first probably like 6 years of my career. That is one of the things that made it accessible, was it was like an all-in-one tool where you can draw characters, animate them, and write script, and then also very easily distribute them very widely. Whereas like Game Maker, you can still do that in, but even if you're using something like Godot or Unity, you have to like find another tool to create your assets and then bring them in, and then something else for the audio, and every tool's like another barrier.
Yeah, I've got like a big history of doing editing video and using Photoshop and stuff, so I can see why like making your own art for a game could be like a big barrier for people that haven't used all of those other digital media tools. And even with that, I still really like Game Maker because I can draw directly in the engine. And so yeah, I mean, different tools have different workflows, and the sort of need to be like a multimedia person that's jumping around between multiple different programs is really, really high when you get to the kind of more high-end engines. Let's kind of step through what's in the actual chapters then, because I feel like we've given a big rundown of what the book is, generally speaking, and what it isn't. So the first chapter is where we get the kind of argument that games need to be taken back, that they are too homogenous in terms of what's in them and what players can do in them. And I think actually quite a good argument, like quite an effective argument for me, is the bit where she shows the NES controller and the Xbox controller. And it's meant to help you understand that the audience for games, or the audience for like hardcore console games, has got much more focused because they've sort of like grown up with the medium, and that's allowed them to like make it more complex, but then that maybe makes it less accessible to new people. And it shows you a NES controller and it's like, look how simple this is compared to the sort of Xbox or Xbox 360 controller.
Yeah, I guess it's the sort of part that I couldn't quite work out is like, it's taking video games back, but from whom? Like, I sort of agree with her that there was like a homogenization of the people that were making video games professionally, but as far as I can tell, the industry's always been like that.
Yeah, and well, I think that's kind of what it's getting at. But, and that's I think part of that is it sort of ties into why, if you go back and you look at when you have had historical game genres that were more associated with like a less violent, less techy audience, they tended to not be on the consoles. It's even where the idea of a AAA games industry comes from, right? So AAA is a financial services term for like a sure bet. So often in AAA games, you get very kind of conservative creative decisions made because they are trying to appease shareholders. So they want to do the thing that they know has the best chance of doing well, even though that's not really, how creative work works.
Yeah, well, in my sort of research for this, I sort of looked up what the biggest mainstream games in 2012 were. There were Halo 4, Call of Duty, Black Ops 2, Assassin's Creed 3, and then the sort of annualized like FIFA and NFL titles. So like even back in 2012, like we were deep into like, creative conservatism and, sequels forever.
Do you want to be a type of dude that kills people with a gun, a knife, or a football?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if you go back before this book was written and all of the efforts to do like games for girls type movements and everything, they were always or usually focused around the PC or some other object, because the console by that point had got so strongly associated with like dude bro games, and particularly Xbox at this point. Not so much the PlayStation, but the Xbox in particular. This is a little bit after kind of like the emergence of casual mobile games as well, which had a much more diverse audience, but that was because you didn't have to buy a device that was dedicated to it. So people didn't feel like I need to be a quote unquote capital G gamer to play these games because it's on my phone that I need for work and family stuff. So that you got a different audience out of that as well. So this introductory chapter does some of the similar work that we saw in the Jason Schreier book a few months ago, where it just takes you through all of these terms you should probably know if you want to understand the games industry. Like what are AAA games companies? Why do they make what they make? What is crunch? All of these kind of things. Yeah, and it's like a helpful introduction to those things, but it's stuff that most people would probably already know if they're coming to this book as a gamer that pays any sort of attention to even just like games journalism.
Yeah. No, and she then sort of like follows that up by starting to talk about like what she perceives as her antidote to that.
Yeah. Which is?
This is the point where she starts talking about making personal video games and the benefits of that creatively over, the AAA games that are being made at the same time.
Yeah, and there's some interesting stuff here where it's like it feels like such a strange time capsule, because you've got like Jonathan Blow name dropped as one of these people. Yeah, Jason Rohrer, but these are like the rich white dudes who get profiled for magazines. And it's kind of coming back to what you were saying before about like Indie Game the movie, where like a certain type of game developer got the spotlight, and then the type of stuff that Anthropy is talking about here is, I guess it's still marginalized to some extent. It's kind of, if you met most people who were interested in making games and you told them that you make games to express yourself, they would be like, "What do you mean?
Yeah,
how does that work?"
Yeah.
There's in this chapter there's like a sort of a criticism of the idea of game features and the idea that games are marketed through this list of things that are in the game, like 300 of this, a system that does this. And I think that's interesting, because I think that's still very, very relevant to indie game marketing now, because I think people that play smaller indie games aren't attracted by features. They're attracted by like the overall vibe of the thing.
Yeah.
There's a paragraph on chapter 19 where she says, smaller games with smaller budgets and smaller audiences have the luxury of being more experimental or bizarre or interesting than $12 million games that need to play it as safely as possible to ensure a return on investment. Imagine what a video game industry that wasn't focused on hits, that wasn't required to make hits, would create. And I mean, we have that a little bit now. I mean, Megabonk.
Yeah.
These kind of weird little games where they don't have to be super polished. I feel like we do have that to some degree. And the thing that I struggle with as a games educator is getting people who want to make games to acknowledge this in the first place, because I find so many sort of people that are just starting out making games and are maybe coming at it as a technical problem. they just don't play indie games and they don't value things that are small and weird, and they are only interested in making their own game if it can look like Blizzard made it. And I find that's like one of the hardest parts of like making these podcasts and doing my YouTube channel and stuff like that, is people that want to make games and they think an indie game is just like whatever someone makes and puts on Steam, rather than acknowledging that it's this kind of subculture of small weird games.
Yeah, and it's people sort of like talk about how much the AAA industry sort of like stagnated, and it is because it sort of, plays it safe and it constantly regurgitates, these same old ideas, and, the indie game space is where like really interesting new ideas come, and, it's I don't know how you teach someone to be interested in that.
Yeah. And just a pattern, I'm not going to be able to talk about all of these, but the pattern throughout the book is just, there are loads of little kind of italicized titles of games that are unusual games that did something interesting historically. And I would like to go through and play all of them, but I think some of them will not be accessible anymore. But here you get a game that you can only play once, and then it kind of records your IP address and then doesn't let you play it ever again.
No, it's
called We the Giants.
If you do end up reading this book, I can recommend taking breaks when you see these titles, and if you can't even find the game anymore, there's usually a YouTube video with some gameplay on it, and I found that like a really useful thing to do while trying to visualize what she's talking about.
Yeah, I mean, even if you're not interested in the more sort of artsy-fartsy side of expressing yourself through games, I find some of these types of games are so small, and often the focus on like slice of life domestic type things means that they're having to do mechanically interesting things because they're representing something that doesn't usually get shown in games. So like one of my favorite examples of a small art game, have you ever come across a game called Jostle Parent?
Yeah.
It's like a little 1-bit game. I don't think it's mentioned in this book. It might be more recent, but you're like running around the house trying to stop your kids putting their fingers in plug sockets or going in the road, and you're just doing it by like brute force pushing characters by directional shoving, and it's so funny, and it's just such a good example of how, if you do choose to make games about a non-standard topic like everyday life, and you can even go back to old games like Paperboy for this. If you make a game that's not about going into a dungeon and killing all the monsters, or going onto a spaceship and killing all the monsters, it suddenly presents you with this kind of forced creativity of like, oh, I don't actually know how a bicycle should handle in a video game, because there just aren't enough bicycle video games for there to be like a UX precedent for how that should control.
You can't download just one of the like Godot templates and immediately have a bicycle working. You have to think about how it'll work.
Yeah, the second chapter of this book is called The History of Magic, and it's where we kind of get into lots of things. You get like snippets of code showing you how difficult it used to be to write when you had to code in assembly. We get Dungeons and Dragons, and how that kind of ties into the emergence of video games.
Yeah, the assembly is like a interesting sort of thing, because I remember being a programmer at that time, and much more senior programmers would often say, well, you're not a real programmer unless you're writing an assembly, and sort of how absurd that seems now.
Yeah, and we kind of the chapter sort of progresses up to a point where we get a snippet of inform code, which is the one that I said that's actually written in English. So it's like, the plural of a piece of candy is pieces of candy. A piece of candy is a kind of thing. A piece of candy is always edible. 4 pieces of candy are in the Halloween bag. And you can see how it's quite laborious, because if you were writing that in another language, you would put like candy.edible equals true or something like that. But it's an example of how over time we've developed things that have made it easier to engage with making some sort of game. And it kind of mirrors my own experience, because I always went for like whichever engines didn't require me to do code or would have some sort of visual scripting and stuff. And then I ended up working backwards from that, because some of them allow you to start in the drag and drop version of code and then convert it so you can see what that drag and drop is achieving, and then you can like reverse engineer your own logic to learn the language. But I guess it's kind of set up as a little bit of a kind of, look, it's difficult, but it's way easier than it used to be kind of thing. Like exactly like your assembly example. Like on my day, we had to write things in assembly. But yeah, we got these kind of early historical chapters that are about the development of the industry, the kind of changes in game making tools. And then in chapter 3, we get to what is it good for. So this is all framed around the definition of games. A game is an experience created by rules, which is, okay, you know, that's very broad. You know, she admits this herself. You could have a rule like don't feed the birds at the park or something. And that's not necessarily a game. But it's not an experience that was like deliberately created in the way that a game is, right? So in this chapter, we go from an idea of like you can look at a game and think about who made it based on what's in the game, and we used to be able to do that on a broad cultural level, and now we can do it with like this person made this game, and here's what they were saying with that. And the historical example is comparing chess to, I'm going to pronounce this terribly, Kniffetafel. Do you know how that's pronounced? So the old school Viking chess was actually like 4v1, and the player in the center was the king, and all of the other characters had to like come in from the sides and beat them up. And the idea here is that, you know, chess is more representative of what kind of feudal Christian Europe was like, with kind of two equally matched royalties fighting each other with armies, whereas the Viking chess was more similar to what Viking life was like, or what Viking war was like. And that's an example of how we can look at those games and sort of extract some sort of cultural context from them. But as we kind of go towards modern video games, we get the idea of a designer game and like a named person who made this game. And then in this chapter as well, we just get all of this stuff about rules and how games are made up of rules, and how, you know, in an analog game, the players have to know all the rules, but in a digital game, you can have a lot more nuance because the rules can be handled by the computer, right? So there's like some examples from Mario of how you can have like very subtle changes in how jumping works in different contexts, for example, and because the computer is handling that under the hood, it just means it can be much richer and more complex, and give the player more to learn as well.
Calculate Mario's acceleration yourself. But yeah, like I think one of the sort of important books that I don't think she necessarily lays out, but she talks about how, you know, games are good at exploring ideas about systems because they themselves are systems. So, you know, a lot of the time, you know, you might be a creative person. We sort of spoke about this in the Understanding Comics episode, but, you know, when you're going, I want to do something creative, why a game? If it's exploring, you know, systems, that's sort of like, well, you can't do that in any other medium. Whereas like if you've got a particular story that you want to tell, like it might benefit from being a system, like a lot of wine games, but, you know, you might also, if you really think about it, just want to write a book.
Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking in that direction, if you were to take one of the most kind of story-heavy video game genres, like a visual novel, for example, like if you take a dating sim, which is like a subgenre of visual novel, where you know, in that genre, you meet multiple characters and you make judgments about them, and you decide who you want to invest in a relationship with in that style of game. And that's an example of where, okay, a romance novel might have a little bit of that. There might be a love triangle or something, but the system afforded by it being a video game means that we can have like 5 suitors, right? And we can make choices of like, who do we just flat out exclude? And who do we, you know, maybe there's 5 suitors and we've got 2 that we just flat out don't like from the beginning. So we don't talk to them at all. And then the other ones, it's like, okay, we're going to selectively choose who to go on dates with and who to get information from. And that's like that's a system, even though it's a branching narrative. That's a situation where, you know, someone might have a type of story that they want to tell where it is justified in it being a game, because you can already think of like, you can think of what the player verbs are, which are in those cases are to like judge and to like most visual novels and interactive fiction they don't have obvious mechanics happening on the screen apart from choosing the next line of dialogue. But what the player is doing in their head is they're kind of making judgments about things, right? And that's enabled by the fact that it's like an interactive system where you can choose to look at some of the content and not others. I think another example of a game that's come out since this is Her Story. Her Story is a game where you're looking at loads of kind of evidence of a woman and trying to work out whether she did a crime, and you're retrieving this video from a big system. And again, that's like all of the content is just little bits of video. It's a movie if you watch it in a certain order, but the fact that it's all played through like an information retrieval system is what makes it interesting as a game and makes it work.
Yeah, and the order that you watch the video can also change your interpretation of what's happened.
And you could do that with a book, but it's not usually encouraged.
Yeah, I wonder if there are any romance novels that have been written in sort of the style of like a fighting fantasy where, you know...
I hope so.
If you want to follow a particular suitor, you have to like turn the page 30.
So yeah,
and dice. Nothing sexy than dice.
So yeah, chapter 3 is about that. Chapter 3 is kind of telling us, you know, if you want to make a game, this is what games are good for, or this is why you should make a game. You know, like games are using rules to make statements or tell stories about systems or to explore systems in some way. It's a similar idea to what you get in a sort of more dry academic philosophical direction from Ian Bogost, who you might read one day, but this is in much more kind of conversational tone. We get the next chapter is all about mods, which is like a nice little nostalgia trip for us, I guess, but it's also, I think it's interesting the way that this is kind of structured into the book in this order, because this is very much the way that I learned to make games, and it's the way that I've always encouraged other people to, even to this day, is like start by changing things that already exist rather than trying to make something from scratch.
Yeah, that used to be like quite a big entry point for people getting into the games industry as well. Like people would get their first job by showing off their portfolio of mods they'd made. I
think a lot of people's portfolios do still contain mods. It's just you don't hear about it until it's like, oh, someone made this massive Skyrim mod and now they've got a job at Bethesda. But I regularly meet people who started off making Steam Workshop mods or making user-generated content for things like, you know, Fortnite or Roblox, and then, you know, they learnt Lua through Roblox, and then they went off and did something else. A recent example of that is the guy that made Schedule 1, the weed game.
The drug game.
I think he'd been like a Roblox tycoon developer for a while. And I think there's this like sort of, there's this move that we see a lot where it's like kind of like a premature professionalization where people are like, well, I won't learn that thing because that's not like a proper way of making games that I can monetize. And it's like, you're not going to make anything of monetizable quality in the first like 3 to 5 years of your career. So it's totally fine if your first experiences of making games are not in Unity or Unreal or something that's been deemed to be quote unquote a proper game engine, you know?
Yeah, no, I think you should always be trying to make your first instinct to make something cool, rather than, you know, necessarily marketable.
Something cool and easy to make.
Ideally shareable as well.
Yeah, I think the shareability thing is important because that gets you to immediately thinking about players, and the amount of people that I've met that have spent so long learning like the technical aspect of like, can I make a video game on my own in Unity or whatever, and the time between them starting and the first time they put anything that they've made in front of a player is too long, and for some people it's infinitely long. You know, I see YouTubers that are working on like a dream project, and I search around trying to find where the playtest for this thing is, and it looks so polished and it looks so deep into development, and there's nowhere I can go and play it, and there's never been anywhere that anyone can like publicly go and play it, and I just think, what are you doing?
Yeah, no, like I mean, I guess on the flip side, there can be like you know, satisfaction getting out of like the pursuit of like, you know, just the technical side of it and like learning that, but you know, I don't think you can be disappointed when you come out the other end of it and go, well, why is this a bad game? You could go, But like I've got like a bunch of like tech prototypes and things that no one else but me has ever seen them, and every couple of years I'll be working on another thing. Go, oh, I've got a thing that I worked on that's useful for that. So it doesn't feel like wasted time, but I think at the time I sort of knew I wasn't making. Oh, this is my indie game movie that's gonna
Yeah,
buy me a house.
Tim Kaine calls them his toys when he makes those kind of little prototypes, which
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
is helpful. People get really het up about defining games and like, oh, why does every game design book start off with a definition of games? And it's like, well, games are defined by the thing that happens when someone plays them. And the problem that a lot of people have with, pushing past that point where they are tinkering as a hobby, which is totally fine, but people get stuck there because they never take on that kind of idea of what a game actually is for the player. And it's very easy to think, well, this is a game engine, and that means that any time I spend using this game engine is doing quote unquote game development. And it's like, well, in a way, yes, like whatever you make in Godot is a game because you made it in a piece of game software. But that's kind of like, you could say the same thing about music, right? You can like spend 100 hours making the perfect drum beat on any piece of music software, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you made a piece of you made a song that anyone else can appreciate. You just spent a long time on one thing that you were interested in. And I think the point at which it becomes game development is like when you're actually thinking about the thing as something that someone else plays.
Yeah, no, 100%. But yeah, I think you just need to know in the moment when you're spending all that time. Which one you're
the
doing.
reason I like this little chapter that is about modding, and also about, I think, machinima, which is, modding is still a thing. Machinima maybe not so much, but this kind of having that focus of like making things quickly using existing game tools and then sharing it. I think it just shortcuts that problem. And I think it can shortcut that problem for a lot of people because it's just immediately there for people to interact with, and you can't avoid that. You can't just like spend another year polishing your game before you release it to an audience of zero.
Yeah, especially depending on like the type of experience you want. Like, if you want, a game where you walk around in first person and interact with things in a world, then, there's so many tools out there and existing games that let you do that very quickly rather than like having to, again, go into like Unity, build a character controller from scratch and, your own asset pipeline. And if you're not releasing that to be its own unique product. And like, I mean, even some of the times, like, there's a bunch of very large games that started their life as mods. Like, I think of, all the like custom maps in Warcraft 3, like, that's where like Dota and those sorts of games started their life. Auto chess. So yeah, there's a fertile ground in modding.
The game design practice is transferable, and a lot of the technical stuff ends up being transferable in some shape or form, and that's why often when you meet really senior programmers, they're not so concerned about having to like switch between tools because they know that, okay, there will be a learning curve, but I've learned different languages before, I've learned different IDEs before, whatever it is. Whereas people, when they start out, they're like, I must pick exactly the right tool for now because I will be using it for the rest of my life. And it's like, yeah, it's not really what happens. But this chapter made me go and look up a little bit of my early modding digital footprint. I had a bunch of voice packs for Icewind Dale 2 that I'd put on. Yeah,
oh wow!
It was so Icewind Dale 2 was like a same engine as Baldur's Gate 2, top-down CRPG using Dungeons and Dragons rules, and there were voice packs that were like little MP3s that characters would say under certain conditions, like "I'm nearly dead, I need a potion," or you click on them and they go "I'm ready," and you send them somewhere and they go. And what I was doing was I would take a character from another video game, like Dagoth, the end boss from Morrowind, or the Dungeon Keeper narrator or the narrator from Shogun, and I would go through all the audio files and chop them up, and then I would insert them into a new voice pack for Icewind Dale. And I think I made about 5 of them and put them up as a zip, and they've got like 3,000 downloads over the past like 2 decades.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's just
Yeah.
funny. That's one of those things that I didn't think I was learning at the time, but it taught me how barks work in video games. It taught me how like file structures work. It taught me a little bit about kind of UX and how you use the sort of narrative elements of the games, like characters talking and stuff, to communicate stuff about the states of the game. And that's all stuff that if I wanted to do that in my own game, I would have to build the whole of Icewind Dale 2 before I got to the stage where I'd need to implement barks.
Yeah, there was something nice about, like, it wasn't all games back then, but games were like easier to sort of like dig around in their guts like that. Like I remember, in high school I'd make, flash animations, but I quite often like dig around in the file system for Worms Armageddon because you could like get to a bunch of their assets from that, and you could like very easily rip out sounds and use them in your own things.
I mean, you mentioned like Dota and Warcraft. I used the Warcraft 3 map level maker for years, and the thing about that was you were using the tool that they used in the studio to make the game. So you had, designers, whether they were technical people or not, but they'd been made this tool by the tools engineers at the studio. And then as a gamer at home, you were using the same tool that was used to make the levels for the game. And that has a bunch of different effects. But one is like you get immediately into doing the design rather than the programming. You are touching bits of the programming because you can see like the database of the game, right? So something like the Warcraft map editor was very similar to something like RPG Maker, if you've used that, where it's like there is a big database of what all the units are, what the buildings are, how the economy of the game works. And you're getting to see that and touch it all. And that means that later on, if you do come to make your own games, you sort of already know what a good structure for a game is and how the separation between like code and data works in a like a AAA game.
Yeah, and it's also an important lesson about the value of tools. I like building tools for my own game, but just make sure you don't build them.
It's kind of one of the things I lament now is that if you want to do a design job or a level design job in a modern studio, you're often not going to have a specific tool built for that game. You're going to just, everyone gets on GitHub and jumps in the same Unity or Unreal project. And that's like a little bit of a nightmare because you've got like non-technical people running around where they can touch the code in a way that just didn't happen on those types of projects in the same way. I might be talking out my butt a little bit, but I think there is a value to having like a level editor that is just totally separate from the game so no one can break anything.
Yeah, like I mean, like when I'm working on a project with designers, like I kind of like it when they get stuck in and aren't afraid to break things because if you've written the game well enough, then it shouldn't be that hard to unbreak them if they do get muddled up. But yeah, I was sort of like reading about visual scripting after this, sort of on the back of Twine and what's the big visual scripting plugin for Unity, Playmaker, which also came out at around the same time as this book. And like games like Hollow Knight, they use that for their like enemy AI. So you can sort of compartmentalize things in a project in a way where technical people and less technical people can be sort of moving in the same space.
I think one of the things I always appreciated when you're designing and you have a tool is it's set up to do things, but you can maybe mess around with it a little bit. And I sort of learned that when I was using Warcraft, where it's like, okay, we can actually take an art asset from elsewhere in the game and we can like make a unit that's a tree or whatever. And then I would apply that quite a bit later on. So like the first job I got at a mobile game studio, we used to build our levels and our menus in Flash or in Animate. It had updated to Animate at that point, but we were still in Flash. And then it would be like compiled into Cocos 2D. And we were working on Amateur Surgeon and we made a level that was like a Escape the Room level, but we used all of the same tools that were used in the main game and just kind of misapplied them. So instead of operating on a body, you were like cutting through like cobwebs and stuff. And I've always enjoyed doing that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
There was another game where we had like a massive database of all the game components on this big online content management system. And I think I made a boss where I took an asset from another character that was like the head of a robot and I turned it into their projectile for their gun. So they just had like an exploding robot head. It's like there's something about having the constraints of someone else's tool and system that's like, okay, how can I really push this to do weird stuff? Which is how you get Dota, right? That's how you get Dota out of Warcraft 3 and why it's such a weird mix of like the control conventions of an RTS applied to some totally different game that isn't actually a real-time. Well, I guess it's a real-time strategy game in a way, but it's not about like commanding a big group of units.
No. And yeah, that's again like a product of the constraints that it was created under.
And also, yeah, I mean, this chapter is it's all about mods and stuff. And I think if someone is just starting out now, modifying something that already exists is a really great way to get into games because it's just there's so much of the game that's already there, and then it forces you to have these creative challenges of like, how do I make what I'm trying to make fit into that, or how do I fit it around how it already works? And it just kind of shortcuts the blank page problem, which if you're starting making games and you don't know how to program, then obviously making an entire game from scratch is really daunting. But even when you do know how to program, it kind of gets you creative much more quickly to have some sort of enforced constraint, either because you're like making a sequel to another game, so a lot of the design is already decided, or you're in a game jam and someone sets you a constraint, so you have to like deliberately you end up being more creative because you can't just make anything, right? And there's lots of different ways of setting a constraint, but making something with or out of a game that already exists is a really good way of doing that.
Yeah, and like, I'm a complete hypocrite because I don't think I've ever done this, but like modding could be like a really good prototyping tool as well. Like if you've got an idea for a game and you want to like test it out to see if it's any good, rather than like jumping into like, Unity or Unreal or, something where you've got a completely blank canvas, like finding a game that, that's pretty close to the idea that you have and modding it instead can be like a much faster way to get to your go no go point on whether you want to keep pursuing the project. And
yeah, a couple of shout outs for anyone who just wants to like point at the book and go, I know that game. You've got like the fan translation of Mother 3. Was it Earthbound? Yeah. You've got that's mentioned here. You've got a couple of Robert Yang's games, Radiator. You've got mods of Quake, all of the stuff to kind of change Quake and Doom characters into women because those games didn't have any women in. Brendan Chung's games like Gravity Bone. It's just like really a who's who of all of the interesting things that were going on where people were using games to either modify the main game or make something else out of them. There's a lot of stuff about ZZT here, which is like a ASCII ASCII game that you can make stuff for.
Which was a bit before my time, but like, it seemed very influential.
Yeah. So chapter 5 after that is called The New Video Game. So we go from like talking about the games industry generally, the history of the games industry, what are games good for, how you could just modify games that already exist. And then this chapter is starting to give a bunch of little examples or case studies of small experimental games that are emblematic of what this book is about and what Anthropy cares about and what Anthropy thinks the author should try and make. And it takes you through all of these examples. So you've got Bigged, which is the series La La Land by Matt Aldridge, which is like a strange, surreal little game. We've got Seekless. They've all got strange names, these. They're very kind of SEO resistant names. I will put as many URL links to the games in this book as I can on the show notes. You've got Calamity Annie, which is one of Anthropy's own games. Anything in this chapter that jumped out at you as something that sounded interesting or something that you'd played before?
What was the Death from Overwork? Was that part of this chapter? Yeah, I remember playing those at the time, and that was a little trip down memory lane for me. If I remember it correctly, it's you're sort of like playing out different scenes in like a salaryman's life. Is that
Yeah,
right?
I think so.
Yeah, I don't remember like the gameplay especially well, but I've got like you know the neurons of the like the art style, and I think you like had to say goodbye to your wife like every day before leaving for work. It's the one takeaway I remember from that game.
Yeah, and this is kind of interesting because it's kind of giving us a sense of all these people working together in a scene, and it's bouncing back and forth between Anthropy talking about her own projects and then other people's projects, and it's just like, look at all this stuff going on, isn't it interesting? A lot of these things weren't difficult to make. We've got Anthropy's game Chicanery, which is like a funny little game where 4 players have to press a particular button, and then the goal of the game, which isn't actually in the game itself as a piece of code or anything, but the goal of the game is to stop the other people pressing their button. And you just like beat each other up basically in the real world. It's just very funny. That's the one where Bennett Foddy is mentioned because he helped make the iPhone port of that. So real sense of kind of people kind of bouncing around in this scene together, helping each other out. There's a great paragraph quote here as well, which like I said, this is a book that is essentially about what we would call art games. It's not about how to make how to sell 1 billion indie games and make generational wealth. But there is a paragraph here that I think is very, very sort of like indicative of how I wish more people would think about making indie games. She says, there's nothing unnatural about a digital game by an individual creator or pair of creators. This is on page 102. It is, in fact, much harder to keep the idea behind a game coherent when the designer is managing a team of many people who are each working on one aspect of the game separately. That's part of the reason why contemporary big-budget games have so much clutter and so few strong ideas. The games are all over the place because the creators were all over the place. It's hard to have a strong singular vision when the process of creation is spread so thin. And this isn't necessarily like saying you can't make a good game with 50 or 100 people. But I think the extreme example of this that most people would point to today would be like the kind of Ubisoft game with, having loads of systems and content, but feels a little bit shallow because it doesn't challenge you, or it just isn't very focused on delivering a particular type of experience.
Yeah, no, it feels like, a bunch of people that sort of like, check into work every day in the big like Wile E. Coyote punch card machine, and then, do the job that comes across their desk rather than the work of an auteur.
Yeah, and obviously that can be romanticized in quite toxic ways, and like sometimes it's just flat out lie. When people, the amount of games that are talked about as solo projects which aren't, like we had that happen with Balatro recently. The guy that made Blueprints is coming up over and over again in the games press, and even in the BBC as like a solo developer. And it's like, okay, you do 95% of the work, but that's not really what the game, the structure of making that game really looks like. But I like the idea that one person sort of having the vision makes the game better because it's more focused. I think that's the takeaway here.
Yeah, I don't want to be like too dismissive of like big game studios as well, because like a lot of the tools that these individual creators are using and benefiting from are because these larger structures are in place, and it's a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah. This is the chapter where we get the love for WarioWare DIY, and it's just kind of drip feeding you tools that are saying like, maybe you could check out this, maybe you could check out this. There's a great quote here about Stencil, which I actually used for a little bit in my mid-20s. Stencil is like, it has the same interface as Scratch, but it allowed you to deploy games as Flash games. Anthropy here says, this is the solution, I think, to put as little distance as possible between the idea and a playable game. And that's why WarioWare is like the closest that Anthropy feels we've come to this like perfect piece of game software where you can just sort of draw things on a screen and then go, oh, this is an enemy and this is a friend, or this is a piece of food, and it just understands what those things mean. Obviously, you can't make super deep things that way, but that's not what you need when you're first starting out. And it's we're talking about here like games as snapshots or sketches. And like, can you just get a quick idea down and allow people to play it and then go, yeah, that's enough, that's fine.
Has anyone ever made Indie WarioWare DIY.
I don't know.
Yeah, someone should.
Someone should, yeah. What was that? What was the Jason Rohrer one that was like Sleep is? Was it called Sleep is Death? What was that?
It's not the one where you're guarding your family.
No. Yeah, I mean, Jason Rohrer is a funny historical case study in this book as well, because he didn't get cancelled, but he made a game that was very, very conservative in terms of you need to protect your family or other players will come and kill them, which was like very like just paranoid tinfoil helmet stuff. Okay, shall we talk about Gay Snipers?
Yeah, why not?
So Gay Sniper is a game where you're a gay sniper who is trying to destroy the American family. And this is used as like a case study where Anthropy is sort of like talking about having an idea for a game and just taking you through step by step how that game was made. And again, it's not a polished game. It's just like a little interactive slideshow. And it's meant to parody this idea of like the LGBT community destroying an American way of life, which was an idea that came from an actual West Virginia for marriage ad campaign. So it's like a piece of satire of another piece of media.
Yeah, it's kind of culture jamming.
Yeah. And there's a little bit of this is a click and play game, which I think was brought up in the Derek Yu episode. I think Derek Yu was a click and play guy before he was a game maker guy.
Yeah, no, it sounded like he cut his teeth in the forum for the click and play community.
Yeah. So this is just sort of showing the reader how Anthropy would work through making this idea into a playable game. And it's very, very simple. It's just like, I need one scene to show this and one scene to show this. And when you click on this, this happens. And it's kind of getting us into what I was talking about at the start, which is, approaching the game less as like, oh, I need a guide to walk across the screen, so I need to learn how to do loads of complex animations, and like thinking less in terms of like feature polish and more just how do I quickly get this set of meaningful symbols and interactions on the screen as quickly as possible so someone can mess around with it. It's kind of taking you through that approach in a very beat by beat way.
Yeah, no, my biggest takeaway I took from that section was she name dropped a sound effects program called SFXR, which I'd never heard of, and then looked it up and thought it was quite
great. Yeah,
I'll probably end up using it.
I use it in every project. Like if I I'll have Audacity open, I'll be making noises with my mouth, and then if I want like a bit crush sound, I'll use SFXR. I always tell people to use it for their placeholder because you get to the sound effect you want way quicker making those little randomized bit crush sounds in SFXR than you do looking through a library. Yeah, I use it for everything.
I'm glad it's still around.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of what chapter 6 is, just kind of taking you through making the Gay Sniper game as like it's like a project breakdown. It's almost what you would write if you were doing a course and you had to make a little portfolio showing what you did and what you were thinking about it. It's kind of taking you through that step by step.
Yeah, which is kind of funny considering all the anecdotes and Anthropy has about what a bad time she had doing a game design course.
Yeah, there is a fair bit of that in here. We get a similar thing with a couple of other games. And they just to give you examples of things like, working with limitations is good. Here's what happens when I made games in ZZT because, it has these limitations because it was made for making a different sort of thing and I'm making another type of thing with it. We've got emphasis on, accidents being part of creativity, all of that kind of stuff.
Bob Ross model.
And also how when you get involved in a community like the ZZT community, it becomes like super specialized and people are just trying to one up each other with making weird stuff with it that you shouldn't be able to make, that kind of.
Yeah, I feel like you get that a bit in like modding communities as well. So if you make a mod for a game, there's, usually a built-in community of people that are also doing that. And, it gets pretty weird pretty quickly.
Yeah. But yeah, that's kind of the chapter that's like loosely about how people make games, not at a technical level, but like the thought processes that go into it and like what order the I coded this and then I drew this kind of thing happens. And then chapter 7, I mean, we talked about these at the start, but chapter 7 is the one where it's really starting to get you into like trying to like pep talk you up for making your own game. I feel like we've talked about most of the content of those late chapters already. But there's some stuff in here in the Bootstraps chapter where it's like, okay, it's in stages, and it's like task 1 is choose a tool, choose what you're making a game in. Task 2 is introduce a character. Task 3 is teach your character to do something. One of the things I really liked here is, we're using the standard language of like verb for like something the character can do, right? They can teleport or they can fly or whatever. But then we get the idea of adverbs being like, describing how you do something. So you fly slowly and you jump quickly, those kind of things. And I think that's quite a helpful metaphor for people because adverbs are basically game feel,
Yeah.
Like you could say like a defining characteristic of Hollow Knight is that Hollow Knight falls slowly, and that's an adverb, like the verb to fall.
Yeah, no, I think this chapter and was the one where it's just a list of things to make games about. Those are the sort of my favorite parts of the book because, like, she starts the book like quite sort of combative and crusty, and like it sort of like ends up in this part where it's sort of like, you can tell she's got like a real like pure joy about making games, and I found that very sort of inspirational.
Yeah. I wish I could inject it into people. Or like put it in the water supply, because I mean, there's a bit towards the end of the book. There's a chapter where she's in the growing up chapter right at the end, page 160. She says, the really lucky ones are the generation who are growing up with access to tools like Scratch and Stencil. For these kids, game creation won't be the mystical, inaccessible thing it was for me. It'll be something they can actually touch. They'll be able to doodle playable games as easy as doodling a comic or writing a simple story. Imagine what this generation will do with video games once they've grown up. So, the Gen Alphas and the Gen Zs who have had access to all of these easy code-free tools. The problem is, and the problem that I see, is that people don't want to do that because they want to immediately be using what they've been told is the commercially viable version of something. And that is because, game development is being presented to people as this sort of get rich quick scheme, entry point to, not having to work for anyone else for the rest of your life. And that sort of premature professionalization of like, okay, you don't even have any skills at doing this thing yet, but you must immediately care, which game engine is going to take a cut of your revenue and stuff like that. It just seems like so much of the entry point into making games in the first place is framed around that. And I think it's why it's probably quite toxic if you're like a 13, 14-year-old that wants to learn how to make games and you just stumble onto somewhere like Reddit looking for advice, and all of the advice is framed around the assumption that you want to be selling the game that you make in the next year, rather than just getting into the basic craft of the thing.
Yeah, no, there's like a very strange tension between like accessibility and commercialization. So like, a tool like Roblox where, kids are, playing it from a very young age and like learning to make stuff in it, like that should be like a, golden age of game design, but because it's sort of like homogenized and like you said, Roblox is sort of like built around the commercialization of it, you're not getting interesting or even like the sort of really vulgar things that you get out of like the Newgrounds era where like Flash was like harder to use, but you could draw something really gross and put it up there and go and it took you an afternoon. And
there's definitely interesting stuff on there, but you do have to dig for it a little bit because so much of it is geared around like trying to get kids to give each other their Robux through their games. It's like all the in-app purchases type stuff. And unfortunately, Fortnite Creative has gone that direction as well, because previously Fortnite Creative was like, oh, you can make a map and other people can play it. And then they added the Unreal thing where you can make a map in Unreal and you can introduce your own art assets and stuff. And now they've started to add in like you can make money in your map by having people exchange a currency with you. So it's just going fully in that direction of Roblox. But I think there's a lot of like knotty stuff here, and the stuff that Anthropy is concerned about in this book is like, conventionally the gateway to getting into games has been learning to program, and both games and learning to program have been like male dominated for a bunch of different reasons. And maybe if we have more different alternative entry points, then more people can get into it. And maybe if we talk about games as if they're literature or art rather than as if they're pieces of software, we can get more people into it. But one of the things that I see happening a lot of the time is, people are poor or come from poor backgrounds, and they see making a game as like a magical way out of that. But the problem is that because they have that framing from the get-go, they're sort of never going to learn by messing around, which is how most people get really good at something in the first place. And I think like the class dynamics that are at work across the tech industry and across the creative industries more generally are that the reason why they're dominated by like people from more privileged backgrounds isn't necessarily because a computer is expensive or because it's expensive to go to university. Those are factors, but it's also the fact that those are kids that were given like the time and the encouragement and the space to just mess around at home on those things, and to like have a PC rather than a console, and to have people in your family that also make art or also code and will just talk to you about it as an interesting subject rather than you can only follow this thing in your life if you can guarantee me it's going to get you a job. That kind of economic anxiety that people have, where they don't want to support their kids to go into something creative unless it's very clearly got like a job at the end of it. And that's not conducive to people becoming good creators, because you develop those skills by just like messing around and following your own curiosity, right?
Yeah, like I mean, my parents were like a little bit like that. Like, they were always like supportive of, being sort of, doing something creative, but it was always like couched in, well, you need to make sure there's a job at the end of it. And, ended up taking advertising as like a sub major because it's like, creative, but, there's also business. And, but yeah, it's, I think going back to your point about, the mindset of people going in there, it's like, there is like a broader problem with like, hustle culture in general. And I think, to a particular type of like downwardly mobile middle class person who, is trying to work out what they want to do with their life. It's like, well, I want to get rich, but I also like video games, so maybe I can become like, an indie game success story, but not do, any of this stuff.
Yeah, never do a game jam.
Never do a game jam.
Never do a game. Why would I? Unless you must pay me to do a game jam.
Yeah,
I see. There's a lot of people like that.
Yeah, never meet people different to you that are also making games and, talk about games nonstop, or, exchange ideas, or like, any of the things that, make up an art scene. And like, I get it as well. Like it's, being able to go, well, I'm going to pursue something that, might not be commercially successful, or, is scary. And, there's I can't remember where I was reading this, but I was talking about like, the success of British music in like the 1970s, and like because there was like a strong, social welfare system, like, kids from working class backgrounds could like pursue music, and as a result you get lots of bands like Joy Division and all the like post-punk stuff that was coming out at that time, and we don't have that anymore, so it's you need to go into it knowing that you are taking a risk, but I think better art is made if you're viewing it through this lens.
Yeah, in the kind of the literature in the sociology of education, that's kind of what a lot of it is focused on. It's like, obviously there's a economic element to class. It's better to have money, right? But people generally do better educationally when they're encouraged, and they have role models around them that are from that same area of the world in terms of like skills and interests and stuff. But also when they just have the resources and time to like learn by messing around. And I feel like that's the thing that's missing. And the thing that worries me a lot, being on YouTube and seeing the sorts of people who pop into my comment section and the other places they're coming from in terms of like the other content creators that they watch and listen to, it feels like there's this kind of loop or there's this kind of like route into the games industry that they're so far outside of, and the way that they want to get into it is just like this magic lottery of like, I will, I'll buy the smallest ticket available. I want someone to tell me what game I can make in 3 months.
Yep.
And then I'm going to enter into this lottery, and I have like a 1 in 1,000 chance that I might make enough money from that. And that doesn't seem super realistic. And for me, as like someone who grew up kind of like, I don't know, working class, lower middle class, depending on how you look at my parents' occupations and stuff like that. Like the way I always saw it was like, I need to do this thing as a hobby until I'm good enough at it, and then someone else will give me a job. And then if I get good enough at that job, maybe then I can make my own thing and start my own company or something like that. And that's kind of what did happen for me. I got my first job in games in my late 20s. I wasn't looking for one. I'd just been making games as a hobby because it was interesting and it was something to do, because I was like working as a classroom assistant, which I found quite boring. And then I was making games and music because I needed something to do to be like, to express myself and to intellectually stimulate myself because I hated my job. And then the portfolio came out of that and the skills came out of that. And then I got a job, and now it's like, I'm further down the line. It's like, okay, now I know how game studios work because I've worked in one. And to me, that's quite a like practical kind of working class way of looking at building a career. Like, if you wanted to be a carpenter or a plumber or something, you would do an apprenticeship under someone else. You would work for them first. And you and I both have that experience now where we've worked for someone else in a studio. So if we were to make an indie game, we would be kind of going indie rather than just like being someone starting out with zero on the outside that has like no experience about how anything works. And then they're just hoping to just like keep making things in a game engine and putting it on a platform, and that's going to somehow make them a living. And I'm sure that does work for some people. But it worries me that seems to be like the dominant way of thinking about the process. And I guess, make a portfolio and get a job is not helpful advice either, because there are so few now. But I think also that can be exaggerated when people have the idea that like, oh, they wouldn't want to work in the games industry unless they got to like be a lead designer at Rockstar immediately,
Yeah. No, I think you need to think of it in like the Albert Camus sort of model of like, or is it Nietzsche? Whoever's like the, focus on like the immediate now, like, make games because making games is fun. You'll make friends who also make games and you'll have interesting conversations, and, don't sort of like project into like, this future version of you that's got a successful game and, is living this amazing life. Like, the act of creation in itself is exciting and fun, and you should be living in the moment.
Yeah, I know it sounds like hippie stuff, but I think
oh yeah, it's art wank.
The problem is that the hippie stuff leads people to being better at their jobs and having more of a chance, because if you can't enjoy doing something just for the sake of it, then you're not going to be competitive with the sort of people who are, because I've met so many people where they're artists or they're programmers, and when they go home from work, they work on some other project and they learn a new skill, and obviously that can lead to burnout and not be good, but they can't help it. That's just how they are. They go home from their job programming in Python and they go and they learn another language as a hobby, and their process of like skilling up for when their current company implodes and they have to get another job is just all happening in their free time as a product of their curiosity about the thing. So I think, as soon as people are asking questions like, oh, is it worth starting? Or, is there any point? It's like, well, if there was any point for you specifically to do the thing, you would be doing it already. That's kind of...
Like, I mean, I remember when I was at university, like, even back then, my lecturers were sort of, calling for the death of Flash and saying, this is a dead technology. And, like, I got a good 6 years of paychecks out of Flash before it was, like, actually dead after university. But, like, the technology itself isn't the point. It was, like, learning how to build digital things and enjoying myself along the way. And, again, I I was doing my Flash job at night and then, coming home and building things in like Phaser and JS in the evening. So when the Flash apocalypse did happen, I sort of had enough skills to step into the next job. But
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's the book for this month. I really like it. It was nostalgic. I feel like it's doing a few things at once that occasionally conflict. It's got a very broad remit in terms of who it says it's for, but I think you could get a lot out of this if you're the sort of person who has really struggled with the technical side of things and just wants to make games that mean stuff. Because even just the way that it frames those things and talks about them is quite helpful. And I found this sometimes, like, we talked about earlier how the barrier to entry is going to be different for different people. It might be technology, it might be art. You just need like multiple entry points so anyone can get into it. And I found that with teaching as well. Like a long time ago, I found that, if you teach math to I had this group of kids that had been like excluded from class, and we were teaching them math, and they're all from like a kind of council estate in the UK. They're sort of working class, and the way that math is usually taught is you teach it in the abstract first, right? And then you teach the practical example that's like long-winded wording of like a real application afterwards.
Yeah.
So an example might be that you're learning how to calculate area, and you learn it through just measuring rectangles, and then you're given an example that is like, oh, we need to work out how much carpet we would use to carpet this L-shaped room,
Yeah.
And I found with these kids, it actually helped quite a bit if you flipped the exercise, and you took away the abstract rectangles, and you just started with the carpet straight away. Because their kind of value system that they were bringing to the problem was kind of like we were saying a minute ago. It was totally kind of like, what's the use of this? I don't want to just know the abstract reason. Show me how this applies to a real world situation. And they needed it to be front loaded that way. And then you could flip it afterwards and then teach them, okay, what other type of rectangles and squares are there in the world that we could apply this to?
Yeah.
Okay, now you see the value of the abstract knowledge because you've seen the practical reason. And it's kind of like that sort of thing of people are going to come to things with their different biases towards being scared about technology and scared about code, or being scared of like making a piece of art that looks ugly. And you need like a diversity of tools that allow people to engage wherever they're coming from,
Yeah, no, like, I mean, I wish I'd been taught maths like that, because, yeah, I remember, doing trigonometry in high school and, like, how do you calculate the angle between these 2 points? And, I wasn't a great student. And then years later, when I'm making games, like, oh, how do I make this enemy rotate towards this other enemy? It's like, oh, crap, that's all that stuff I should have been paying attention to years ago. But
yeah. Like the amount of people that have like humanities degrees where they might be scared of programming, and then if you start to explain it to them in terms of the higher level philosophical stuff and talking about ontologies and stuff, they're like, oh, now I understand.
Yeah.
And when you started them off with like, oh, this is a function, this is an if statement, they were like, no.
Yeah.
And then you start talking to them about like philosophical parts of programming, they're like, oh yeah, I get it. And it's just like we develop a kind of orthodoxy for like, this is the correct order to learn this thing in, and it doesn't work for everyone. Some people need to. It's kind of like the example you were talking about from the comics book, where people get into making comics from different places. Some people get into it from like the craft of making the thing, and some people get into it from the idea that they want to express, right? And they might have entered comics because they had an idea and they didn't know if it was going to be a book or a film, and they were just like, oh, maybe comics is, people have different entry points into a medium, and the medium benefits from trying to enable all of those entry points rather than treating one as like the only correct way in. And I think the problem that we have with like the over commercialization of indie games as like as a hobby, like even just a refusal to call it a hobby because it's like, no, I'm learning to be a commercial game dev, is it denies all of these interesting entry points where you can learn through modding, or you can learn for like making maps for something else, or making Roblox games, and you don't have to immediately go to this or that engine because of how many platforms it can ship to, or what percentage the platform owners take if you make a hit game. Because let's face it, most of us,
No.
just aren't going to. So why is every conversation about which game engine to use when you go on Reddit about like, oh, Unity take this percentage or something? That shouldn't be someone's entry level concern with which program to use. The way that you work that out is you try 2 or 3 tools and you go, which one of these did I find easiest? And then, if that one's more expensive, then so be it. That's the one that you get on well with. But it's just all a little bit backwards.
Yeah.
And I think some of the problems that the book describes have only got worse, really.
Yeah, no, it's the temporarily embarrassed millionaire mindset.
Yeah, so slightly pessimistic note to end on, but I think there's probably still a lot of video game zinesters out there. I'm going to put a list to as many of the games that I can find links to from this book in the accompanying notes, whatever platform people are listening to this on, so you can go and have a click through and see the sorts of things that are being talked about. And did I tell you what the next book is yet, Tom?
You did. I've forgotten the title.
So the next book is actually the first time we've got a review copy from a publisher. We're not being paid to shill it, but I did ask the publisher for a couple of copies and we got them. The next book is called Next Level, Making Games That Make Themselves, and it is by Mike Cook from Goldsmiths, who used to run Proc Jam, a really good regular game jam about procedural generation and making procedural generation toys. Really like Mike's work. He's a great guy. I've read the first couple of chapters. It seems really interesting. Loads of case studies on like historical examples of procedural generation and how the kind of math and technology behind it works. So feels very useful for you and I, seeing as we're both in the indie game, roguelike hole most of our dev time.
Yeah, no, the chapter list just reads like a list of my favorite games. I'm very excited to read it.
Yep, I've already learnt about the Fibonacci sequence.
Ooh.
It's like Fibonacci, but when there's 3. Very exciting. So, yeah, join us back for that next time. Subscribe to the podcast on whatever you listen to this on. If you're on YouTube, you can follow us on any of the other podcasting platforms if you want to. Some people didn't know that was possible. You can also support this podcast on Patreon if you go to patreon.com/indie game clinic. That gives you a bunch of behind the scenes stuff like some of my show notes from this podcast, access to the Indie Game Clinic Discord, where you can come and bother us and you can ask us, annoying questions like how to mathematically balance your game. And all the other sorts of stuff that I do over here on Indie Game Clinic, like video essays and a new podcast called One More Run, where we're doing like a game club where we play a different run-based or roguelike game every month. We started off with Bad North, and then after that we did Omelette You Cook, and we are just moving into playing Voidigo next. Have you played Voidigo, Tom?
I haven't.
It's like a Enter the Gungeon type thing. I haven't started yet, but yeah, that's all of the kind of stuff that's coming out from Indie Game Clinic at the moment. It's a mixture of like game design education stuff and just stuff highlighting interesting indie games as well, and trying to put all of that stuff together so that people that are making games and want to make games get exposed to a little bit more in terms of what's happening in the field, because I think we're lacking a little bit of that. There's lots of people that want to make games and aren't playing many of them, which is understandable because it's time consuming. Thank you for your time, Tom.
No, thanks for having a chat.
And I will send my cyber pigeon over with the new book.
The game developers line.